The jungle near Quang Tri was quiet that morning, deceptively quiet. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Sergeant Michael Turner led his four-man patrol, each man moving with the weary, practiced caution of soldiers who knew their enemy, listened closer than they watched. They were deep within the labyrinth of the Ashau Valley, an environment where every shadow was a threat and every step a calculated risk. The mist, thick and humid, clung to the vegetation, muffling the already subdued sounds of the early morning. Turner gripped his M16, his knuckles white, his senses strained to the breaking point. His patrol had been operating in this dense region for 72 continuous hours. Exhaustion was a known enemy, but the unseen enemy ahead was about to be far more lethal. Unaware that they had crossed an invisible line, the perimeter of a hardened Viet Cong position, the patrol pushed on. The enemy had been waiting patiently for the terrain to deliver the Americans directly into their kill zone. The silence broke with a sharp, terrifying crack, the sound of an AK-47, impossibly close. Chaos erupted instantly. It was not a battle in the traditional sense, but an ambush, a brutal and immediate dismantling of the American squad. Machine gun fire ripped through the trees, splintering bamboo and tearing through the foliage like a chainsaw. Turner immediately dropped and returned fire, a desperate visceral reaction. He heard the choked cry of Private Jensen to his left, followed by the sickening, wet thud of a body falling into the mud. The world became noise, fear, and the smell of gunpowder and fresh blood. He emptied his magazine, feeling the burning brass casings eject against his hand, but the volume of fire overwhelming them was absolute. He felt a searing blow to the back of his head, followed by a dizzying, terminal darkness. When he woke, he was no longer free. The pain was immediate, a dull, throbbing hammer blow to his skull. His hands were bound tightly behind him with rough fiber rope, already swelling and tearing at his wrists. His mouth was dry, parched from fear and adrenaline, replaced now by the metallic tang of dried blood. He was slumped against a coarse length of bamboo, the light filtering down through the dense canopy above. He was alive, a realization that brought with it not relief, but a deep, sinking despair. He could hear the Viet Cong guards moving around, their harsh, quick voices a constant, terrifying murmur. His men were gone. 3 bodies lay nearby, obscured by mud and fallen leaves. The jungle, once merely a backdrop to their mission, was now his solitary prison. The sounds of the environment, the relentless buzz of insects, the croaking of unseen frogs, the whisper of the wind through the leaves, became his only clock. His war was not over. It had merely shifted from the battlefield to the absolute suffocating terror of captivity. The guards referred to the site as a re-education camp, a grotesque title for what was no more than a crude collection of bamboo huts, a shallow pit latrine, and the cage where Turner was held. It was built with the single, cruel purpose of stripping away every shred of a man's identity and will. The camp's true architecture was the jungle itself, the humidity that never receded, the omnipresent rot, and the isolation that was more painful than any physical beating. Turner's days were a monotonous descent into exhaustion. He was forced into manual labor under the indifferent eyes of his captors, barefoot marches through shin-deep mud to haul stagnant water from a nearby stream, or to collect heavy bundles of firewood. The jungle floor was a hostile mosaic of sharp roots, jagged rocks, and biting insects, ensuring that every step was agony and every wound was immediately prone to infection. The labor was designed less to produce a result and more to wear down the spirit, replacing thought with simple, desperate survival. His rations were meager, a small, often rotten tin cup of boiled rice. Sometimes driven by a primal need for protein, he would deliberately mix the rice with insects he found, maggots or crickets. It was a choice between basic survival and the remnants of his former life's dignity. And in the jungle, the body's simple demands always won the argument. He became a connoisseur of filth, learning which types of water were least likely to kill him and which parts of a captured rat were edible. The physical transformation was rapid and brutal. His muscles melted away, his skin stretched taut over his ribs, and his eyes sank deep into his skull, permanently haunted by hunger. Night, however, was worse than the day. The mosquitoes were relentless, their high-pitched, endless song a permanent accompaniment to the prisoner's delirium. Sleep was a desperate, feverish scramble, constantly interrupted by scratching, pain, and the gnawing awareness of his helplessness. The darkness was suffocating, punctuated only by the dim, oily flicker of a kerosene lamp in the guard shack. It was in this darkness that the true fear took root. On nights when the rain fell, heavy and tropical, masking the sound of their movements, the guards would get drunk on rice wine. Their war songs, shouted in a language Turner couldn't understand, sounded like mockery and triumph, resonating through the hollow bamboo walls of his cage. They were songs of victory and pride, celebrating the destruction of everything Turner represented. These were the sounds that truly pierced the quiet horror. The insects, the drunken guards, and the ever-present distant roar of war that had put him there. The tropical fever was a constant companion, cycling through chills and blinding heat, blurring the line between consciousness and absolute madness. He began to forget what rain sounded like on a tin roof or the simple comfort of a soft bed. His life had been compressed into the dimensions of a small, mud-floored cage. Months blurred into years. The distant war continued its grinding pace, but inside the cage, time itself had ceased to be linear. Turner's life became defined by the routine of suffering and the daily struggle for breath. He forgot his own voice. The sound of cars, music, or laughter had become ancient history. He became meticulous, carving small, deep tally marks into the bamboo wall for each sunrise, a desperate, ritualistic attempt to maintain a connection to the civilized world's calendar. Eventually, the marks became too numerous, too chaotic, and he simply lost count, submitting to the eternal, formless flow of the jungle. Sergeant Turner was gone, replaced by a ghost whose existence was defined only by the lines in the wall. Then, the unimaginable happened. One afternoon, a guard approached the cage. He was not one of the cruel ones. He was younger, quieter, his eyes holding a certain deep-seated fatigue. He held something small and fragile in his hand, a photograph, torn, faded, and creased from handling. It was a picture of a smiling woman and two young children. Turner's family, retrieved from the ruins of his gear. "Your family?" the man asked in broken, heavily accented English. The sound of the words, the simple acknowledgement of his former life, was a physical blow. Turner could only nod, tears burning behind his eyelids. The question was a brutal reminder of everything he had lost and what he was surviving for. The guard said nothing more for a long moment. He stared at the photo, his expression unreadable, his face cast in shadow. The image was a gateway to a world of shared humanity that transcended the brutality of the conflict. He was an enemy soldier, a jailer. Yet in that instant, he was simply a man holding a picture of a family he would likely never see again. The tension in the air was palpable. Two warriors from opposite sides, separated by language, uniform, and ideology, yet united by the primitive bond of family and loss. Then quietly, the guard lowered his gaze and said, "Mine too." That single, simple, profound phrase cracked the ideological foundation of Turner's imprisonment. The hate he had meticulously fostered as a tool of survival suddenly fractured. In that shared instant of grief and human connection, the ideological lines of the war vanished completely. Turner saw not a faceless enemy, a monster, but a mirror reflecting his own devastating pain and regret. The camp was not just a brutal prison, it was, impossibly, a crucible of shared, fragile humanity. He finally had a name for this guard: POW. It was the first act of communication that wasn't an order, a threat, or an interrogation. The shared photograph became a silent pact, a crack of light in the unrelenting darkness. The fragile understanding between Turner and POW deepened into a silent, necessary conspiracy. Turner realized that humanity, like the jungle itself, was not uniform. Some guards were monsters, reveling in casual sadism. Others were simply peasants, farmers, and boys forced into service, their eyes holding the same weariness and fear as the men they guarded. POW was the quiet dissenter. His acts were small, silent, and incredibly dangerous. An extra handful of rice slipped into the tin cup during a water delivery, a brief warning glance that saved Turner from a particularly vicious beating. These were small, daily acts of treason against the rigid cruelty of the camp, proving that even in the heart of war, conscience could survive. The opportunity for freedom came with apocalyptic violence in late 1972. The deep jungle began to rumble, not with thunder, but with the roar of B-52 Stratofortresses. An American air raid targeting a nearby supply route struck the area. The ground convulsed, throwing up plumes of black earth and smoke. The sky turned an unnatural orange, with the ghastly glow of napalm and burning trees. The sound was deafening, a physical force that rattled the prisoners' teeth and threatened to cave in their lungs. In the midst of the chaos, a shockwave hit the camp. Turner's makeshift bamboo cage groaned, then violently collapsed into a pile of splinters and mud. He was momentarily free from the bamboo, but still bound by the heavy, chafing ropes. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and panic. Screaming guards ran in every direction, trying to salvage weapons and secure the remaining prisoners. Then, through the haze, POW materialized. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't yell an order. He moved with a swift, desperate purpose. He drew a small, rusted knife, a tool of the jungle, not of war, and with a single, practiced motion, slashed the ropes, binding Turner's wrists. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, an exchange that carried all the weight of their shared secret. POW, his face tense with fear and resolve, whispered the only word he needed to know: "Run." Turner didn't hesitate. He scrambled out of the wreckage, already running before his feet found purchase in the mud. His body, starved and riddled with disease, screamed in protest, but the will to survive was an engine of pure, unadulterated fear. He ran barefoot, dodging burning trees and shell craters. The jungle, once his prison, was now his only path to freedom. The war that took his freedom was now, in its own savage way, giving him a violent, desperate chance to escape. He ran until he collapsed, hidden deep beneath the tall, rain-soaked elephant grass, listening to the roar of the fire and the distant beat of helicopter blades. Turner ran for 2 days and 2 nights, fueled by adrenaline, delirium, and the faint hope of rescue. He survived on rainwater and raw fear, his escape a harrowing blur of instinct and sheer perseverance. He was found on the 3rd day by a U.S. search and rescue patrol, a ghostly figure, suffering from fever and severe malnutrition, weighing barely 90 pounds. He was lifted onto the helicopter, a living skeleton carried out of the jungle hell. He had physically escaped the camp, but the war, the hunger, and the quiet madness had done their work. He was rescued, but he was not yet saved. The official war ended 3 years later, in 1975, with the fall of Saigon. For the world, it was the final chapter in a long, divisive conflict. But for Michael Turner, the fighting never ceased. The jungle came home with him, residing in the shadows of his living room, the sudden silence of a passing car, and the smell of rain on hot asphalt. His scars were not visible. They were etched onto his soul. He wrestled not with the memory of his captors, but with the profound, painful realization of their shared humanity, a realization gifted to him by the guard named POW. In 1975, the year the war concluded, Turner wrote a letter to a veterans support group, reflecting on his time in the cage and the face of the man who saved him. His words captured the ultimate tragedy of the Vietnam War, a sentiment that resonates through all conflicts. I went to Vietnam to fight an enemy. I was taught to hate, to fear, and to kill a man I did not know. But I came home realizing the enemy was war itself. The enemy was the system that convinced me to hate a man who loved his family just as much as I loved mine. Michael Turner survived captivity and escaped the jungle, but he carried the invisible, spiritual scars of that simple, terrible truth for the rest of his life. His experience taught him that even in the darkest, most brutal corners of human conflict, a small, courageous spark of shared humanity can emerge, and sometimes that spark is the only thing that saves us from becoming the very thing we are fighting against. His was a story of survival, of grace, and of the agonizing price of peace.